Welcome to Business Owner Bootcamp, the Wealthspire Advisors podcast designed to help business owners and entrepreneurs take control of their finances. Hosts and financial advisors Michael Delgass and Sandy Wiggins break down key topics like tax strategies, exit planning, business valuations, and real-world experiences with expert guests. And now, here are your hosts, Michael Delgass and Sandy Wiggins.
Hello, everyone. My name is Mike Delgass. I'm a co-host of Wealthspire's Business Owners Bootcamp podcast. This is the fourth episode in the podcast series, and I hope you will continue to join us for future episodes. We'll be discussing working with investment bankers on a business sale, planning for personal fulfillment, post-sale, and further advanced tax planning items. Lots more interesting topics coming down the pike, so I hope you'll continue to come along with us on that journey. I'm an advisor at Wealthspire. I work with clients across the country with a special focus on families that own closely held businesses and the complex issues that come with those. And I'm joined today by another of our advisors, Kevin Brady, who works closely with me on many of those business owner clients. And I'm really excited to speak to Kevin today because we're recording this shortly after the passage of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, which made some really important changes to the tax benefits created under the qualified small business stock capital gain exclusion under Section 1202. That sounds really technical, but I think you're going to get really interested when you see the size of the tax benefit that is created under these under this section. Kevin has written and spoken about QSBS many times and is one of Wealthspire's experts in this area. So I'm really happy that he's going to help us along this somewhat complicated but really interesting topic. So welcome, Kevin.
Thanks for the warm introduction, Mike. Looking forward to it.
Me too. We've talked about QSBS as one of the biggest tax benefits with the least amount of appreciation or knowledge around it. So I'm hoping you can help us kind of get started and get introduced to what QSBS is. So why is it such a valuable tax planning tool for business owners, and what is it?
Sure. So let's take a step back and start with the definition of what the benefit is for someone who qualifies for qualified small business stock under 1202. It gives an investor an exclusion that it would be the greater of $10 million or 10 times their adjusted cost basis. $10 million of gain or 10 times their adjusted cost basis. That could be huge. And the reason it's so unappreciated and also powerful, I would say more powerful is the example I'm going to give. There are very few provisions in the IRC, the Internal Revenue Code, that gives you the opportunity to permanently exclude tax. There's a ton of deferrals. There's a lot of ways to defer tax, 401k plans, all the way up through different, deferral. There's a lot of other deferral options. There's only a couple, this being one of them, that let you permanently exclude tax. The other examples might be the gain upon excluding the gain upon selling a home, the Section 121 exclusion, and step up in cost basis when someone passes away. Those are the other two that come to mind. But again, this fits in that category of permanent exclusion of tax that doesn't really exist in a lot of places.
And to your point there, I mean, the step up in basis is incredibly valuable for future generations, but this is something that clients can get for themselves immediately. And while we all want to plan for our families, it's nice to have some benefits for us right now. So this is kind of one of the really big ones that is something that can immediately increase the total amount you put in your pocket tomorrow. So pretty big deal there too.
Absolutely.
So what are some of the requirements to qualify for this big exclusion?
Sure. And, to back up slightly, I should say that for now, we're going to focus on the original requirements and the original benefits of 1202 before the passage of the bill. We'll get to the changes, but just to not confuse anyone, when I earlier referenced $10 million, 10 times basis, that was the original benefit for QSBS. So with that said, there's a couple requirements, and I'm going to start with what the shareholder requirements are, the person who invests or holds the QSBS stock. That shareholder cannot be a C Corp is an easy way to think about it. So it can be an individual, can be a trust, can be a pass-through entity. There's a lot of flexibility in different ways to own it. You just can't be a C Corp to own the stock itself.
Mm-hmm.
You have to get the stock at original issuance. So it can't come through the secondary market. There's a few exceptions of what that means. You can get it via gift or bequest from someone. And also it matters what form of equity you hold. So things like options, convertible debt, original issuance only starts when you actually get that equity, not when it's granted to you, would be the key way to think about it. And the last key shareholder requirement is you got to hold it at least 5 years, at least under the old rules. So you have to hold it from your original issuance date to 5 years past that point.
So just to kind of recap, it applies to founders, right, of businesses. So that matches up really well to business owners, right? Because they're not always the founder of the business, but often they are. So founders of businesses, what about the small part of it? What about the small business part?
So you don't just have to be a founder of business to benefit from this. And this would be where perhaps owning it through a trust or a pass-through entity comes into play. You can be an early investor in 1202.
Mm-hmm.
And
Right.
that private equity comes to mind, an early employee, any of those things also, any of those people, I should say, could potentially qualify for this.
But if I, for example, bought a giant business with, 500 million, $1 billion worth of value, and I converted it to a C Corp, and tried to get a qualification for QSBS, because that's one of the other elements, right? It's got to be a C corporation, the QSBS, not the shareholder, but the actual business. That wouldn't qualify, right? Because that's not small.
That's right. And that's a good segue to, we started with the investor requirements because they're pretty straightforward. There's only 3 of
Right.
them. Let's segue to what are the actual corporate requirements here.
Yeah.
So the C Corp, Mike, which you just brought up, the holder of the shares can't be a C Corp, but the corporation of the shares itself, it has to be. It has to be a C Corp. And that's when, if it's not a C Corp, that point when it, quote, converts is the start of that ticking clock. Some of the other key requirements is it has to be what's called in the IRC defined as a qualified small business. It's essentially an exclusionary test. It really can't, there's a couple prongs to it, but the key of it is it can't depend on the knowledge, the skills, the service of the founders themselves or the key employees. So it has to be broader than that. And there's some other excluded businesses, specifically hospitality, real estate, and all the things you would imagine as a prototypical service business: doctors, attorneys, consultants, financial advisors like us. We can't qualify. We don't qualify under this typically.
Yeah. I'll quick tangent there. There are ways sometimes to kind of peel out parts of a business and say, this is going to be the service side, but we're going to have another kind of facilitator, technology provider, something like that, that is a qualified small business. So, don't give up just because the core of the business is service related, because sometimes you can have a kind of a side business that does end up qualifying.
And on that same note, just because your business is in the same profession, same industry, does not mean by itself that it's qualifying either. There's a number of private letter rulings. There are tax court cases of businesses that were in the legal industry, medical sales industry, device sales. They're increasing PLRs on fintech companies. So there are a lot of avenues you can still qualify for this. It comes down to just, what does your business do? How does it earn its revenue? Is it the service that you're providing, or is it something a bit broader than that, a product
And
specifically?
just for people who don't live and breathe in the tax world all the time, Private letter ruling is a ruling that is issued by the Internal Revenue Service after a specific particular taxpayer petitions for that ruling. And it only applies to that particular taxpayer, strictly speaking, but it does give an indication of what the IRS is thinking, and it tends to be relatively consistent over time because they try to keep the rules, easy to understand, or maybe that was silly because tax rules aren't always easy to understand, but at least consistent. Anyway.
Well,
Um,
thanks. Yeah, thanks for clarifying that, Meg. I think tax nerds, which we tend to fit into,
right.
we use jargon a little bit more than most, so helpful to define that.
So, that was a good kind of overview of how things stood before that One Big Beautiful Bill Act was passed. Um, Typically applies to founders. The kind of classic example in the life cycle of a business is you have a business that is not making money yet. You start this up, you start making money, and you do a conversion to a C Corp right around then. You might get other investors, friends, family, maybe some early stage venture capital, depending on what industry you're in, obviously. And that's the time at which the clock starts ticking, so to speak, because that now is in the right industry. We'll assume it's small because you just started and you're just starting to make money. And it's a C Corp because you did your conversion, and now you have a qualified small business that you can plan around. So how did the new act change some of those rules and some of the exclusions?
Sure. And let me just take through one or two of the last corporate qualifications. Again, one of them is one of the ones that the OBA, we'll call it for short, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act changed. So we talked about what a QSB is, a qualified small business. One of the other stipulations is that 80% of the corporation's assets has to be used towards that qualified business. The actual way you test for that gets very wonky, but suffice to say that just have to use most of your assets towards that qualified small business that you are qualifying for. So, and the last one is the gross assets of your corporation cannot exceed $50 million either immediately before or after issuing stock.
Right.
So, and that's where we'll get to some of the changes.
Okay, great segue. So what are some of the changes?
Sure. So let's start with the exciting. So I think they're all exciting, but let's start with the most exciting one is the exclusion is increasing from $10 million to $15 million. And that'll be pegged to inflation starting in 2027. And all of these changes, by the way, they are only applicable for stock issued after July 4th. So July 5th, 2025 and on, these changes could apply. Any stock issue before that, they don't. And you can't also, you can't, if you had the old shares, you can't just try to reissue them. I would say, oh, hey, now they're issued after July 5th. You could issue new shares altogether, but yeah, just have to be very careful here to delineate what was before July 4th or July 5th, sorry, and what was after it.
Although if you're a business owner now with a business that's structured as an S Corp, for instance, right now, and you do a C conversion, that's a new stock issuance.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Assuming you qualify and hit all the other requirements, that completely counts. So my caveat more applied to those C Corps that are already in existence today, might have already issued stock that qualified under the old rules. And the investors, owners might look at this and be like, well, I want the 15 million exclusion too. There are ways, but you just can't use the old stock to qualify for it.
Right. So we moved from 10 million to 15 million.
Yep.
And, we'll talk about ways of increasing that even more because that's part of the planning around QSBS. But 10 to 15 million is a pretty big change. That's great. What are some of the other changes?
Sure. One of the other big changes was the introduction of a partial holding period. So you remember before this, you had to hold the stock for 5 years. It was an all or nothing requirement. That is now changed. There are 3 and 4 year partial hold periods where if you hold it for 3 years, you get a 50% exclusion. If you hold it for 4 years, you get up to 75% exclusion, and the 5 years gets you up to the 100%.
That that seems huge to me. I mean, the 10 to 15 million change is big, but getting a third of a loaf, a half a loaf, depending on how long you hold it, that seems really, really important to me too. Because, in my experience, once you have a business owner that decides that they might want to sell, 5 years is kind of a long time from that decision to sell, to actual sale. But 3 years is not crazy.
Right.
And you might be getting ready for that sale. You might be, hiring some outside managers or something, talking to investment bankers, maybe changing structure, that kind of stuff. That could definitely be a 3-year kind of thing. So that seems really big to me.
Right. Yeah. The sale process itself might take 12 to 24 months already. So if all I have to do is hold it for another year, 2 years, that becomes a lot more compelling.
Right.
Definitely.
Right. That okay. Um, all right. So those changes seem big and make me want to figure out even more what I can do with QSBS, because now I've got even more opportunities probably to take advantage of it because this time period is shorter, and I've got a bigger upside on the capital gain exclusion. But what if that's not enough? What if I want to do some more? Are there other planning mechanisms that I can use to add on to that?
Sure. And before we get to that, just to be thorough, the last change from OBA was to increase that gross asset test, the $50 million requirement we talked about
Right.
before. That's been increased to 75 million. So that had never been changed since the original introduction of QSBS in 1993, believe it or not. So it's a welcome adjustment, and that also increases with inflation in 2027. So again, all goes in towards the same logic of there's more flexibility here, there's a bigger benefit, there's a partial holding period, there's a lot more things to do. Or people there are more ways to qualify, we should say.
Right. Right. So the universe is bigger in terms of who can qualify. The time you have to wait is shorter in terms of when you have the sale, and the upside seems to be bigger. But again, we're never satisfied. So
Right.
how can we make that bigger,
Yeah.
from the increase?
So yeah, so let's consider an example or a situation where you have a really big potential gain here, and the $15 million, the 10 or the $15 million exclusion, very nice to have, but your gain might be bigger than that. Are there ways to increase that exclusion? And the answer is yes. It's through a process. There are a couple ways. The way that we often encounter in our profession is through a technique called stacking. So stacking involves creating another taxpayer, involving another taxpayer, I should say. It doesn't have to be created. That could be an individual, it could be another trust. All of a sudden, that person qualifies for their own $15 million, 10 or $15 million exclusion on top of the one that you, as the original shareholder, possessed. So the way this exclusion works, it's always on a per taxpayer basis. So if you can create an additional taxpayer, involve an additional taxpayer, that is a way to increase the exemption that you and your trust or other family ultimately receive.
So if there's me and a trust, when you say increase, how much do I get it increased by?
You would get up to your own exclusion of $15 million or 10. For simplicity, I'm just gonna say $15 million on now for the rest of
Yeah.
the podcast. You could get your own $15 million exclusion, and to be technical, the greater of $15 million or 10 times your basis.
Right. So we move from 15 million to 30 million when we have another trust.
Yep.
Um, and you know, often you see family attribution that is within related shareholders. They're considered as a group and that kind of stuff. Do I have to worry about that with QSBS?
I mean, as far as the trust go, Mike, are you referring to?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, let me just give you an example. I'm married, and I've got 4 kids. Um, and if we all owned a business together, all six of us, how many QSBS exclusions would we get?
That's where there are definitely attribution rules at the corporate level that are going to lump you together, I think, where it's problematic. Um, it's not so much an issue of creating the additional trusts and having, Mike, your first kid be the beneficiary, second, third, fourth, and perhaps your spouse be the fifth. There are complications if you are all owners of the business that have to be navigated and worked through.
But I just mean at the very simplest level, if I've got six family members
Okay.
and
Yeah.
therefore six shareholders, I get 6 times $15 million, right?
Right. Well,
Worth
yeah,
of
let's assume
exclusion.
that
So I've
any of
got
that
$90
attribution is not
million
an
of
issue. Right. If
right.
we're just looking at how can we maximize the planning opportunities and setting up those trusts for each of your family members, that's correct. There's also one other really important distinction that we should highlight on how the trust should be set up or what structure they should have. And this will get a little technical, but it's the difference between the trust being what's called the grantor trust or a non-grantor trust. Grantor trust simply means that all the tax attributes of the trust fall back to the person that set it up, the grantor. And there's a lot of benefits to that. We use that all the time. We see and use that all the time in our profession and practice in other places. There's a lot of benefits to doing so. Here, though, a non-grantor trust is what you would want because a non-grantor trust sets up a separate tax entity. It becomes a separate taxpayer. Remember we used those words before. That's the key and the reason you want to have a non-grantor trust in these cases. So in your
Right.
example, each of your children, your spouse, they would have a non-grantor trust if they really wanted to take advantage of their own exclusions.
And I think some of the caveats that you were pointing out around families and how the overlap might be important apply especially in the trust world. And it's kind of the general principle of, the pigs get fat and the hogs get slaughtered. If you try to create, a million different trusts with slightly different beneficiaries, there's probably a point where you have done too much and been a little too clever. But if I've got six shareholders, but then I also have a trust for the benefit of, my wife and four kids, that's probably another additional shareholder I can add effectively without too much risk. And now when I keep adding more, one trust for each of them, now I start to worry a little bit. The more I do, the worse it gets probably. But there's a little bit to be done for sure, and there might even be a lot to be done depending on the facts of the case and that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of opportunity for more stacking depending on what you need. Look, this probably does get technical, but can you talk quickly about the the ability to move back and forth between grantor and non-grantor status and why you might do that in a trust shareholder?
Sure. And that goes back to what we were discussing previously of what gets the additional exclusion and what does not. So if you have a grantor trust, let's assume you have a great estate plan already. There's some grantor trust set up. You like the beneficiaries, you like the terms, the trustees are all people you know and trust. Your options are essentially create a brand new trust, or you could convert that existing grantor trust to a non-grantor trust, flip the switch, so to speak. And that would work here, presuming that the terms of the trust, everything else fit what you want. Just like your example of, pigs get fed, hogs get slaughtered. It probably is problematic to switch back and forth multiple times. So if you had a grantor trust, you flipped it to non-grantor for this reason, this seems like a very good rationale to do it. A $15 million potential exclusion is great. You just don't want to flip back and forth constantly. Is that how you would define it, Mike?
Yeah, and I guess it could go the other way too. If I create a non-grantor trust, which by the way is also called a complex trust, but we'll just refer to non-grantor because it's probably easier to distinguish between grantor non-grantor. So I create a new non-grantor trust to create another shareholder, right? So now I'm getting my additional $15 million capital gain exclusion. If I sell and then wait a few years just to make sure all the dust has settled and I'm out of the audit period of 3 years and everything else, maybe I'll convert it to a grantor trust later on. And there are some estate tax benefits to that we'll be talking about in future episodes.
Yeah.
So yeah, a single flip is probably okay, but flipping back and forth every year or something like that is definitely a problem. And there's gray along in the middle there somewhere.
Right.
Um,
Right.
so look,
Yeah. As
sorry,
planners, we always love to bring up the gray area and always say it depends.
right, right,
But the uncomfortable truth is it does. It really does depend. And there is a lot of gray here.
right. Now, look, I think most people know that C corporations have a double layer of tax. That is, they're taxed by themselves at the corporate level. And then if you distribute money up to the shareholder, that's a dividend and there's another tax there. So it's a double tax kind of regime. So
Right.
that doesn't sound so great. Um, you know, Tell me about the trade-offs here in having a C corp that I've set up to qualify for QSBS.
Sure. The way I like to frame it and think about the math equation here is you're buying QSBS eligibility by paying
Yeah,
more tax now. So it becomes a question of, am I comfortable paying some more tax now, the next few years, 3 to 5, depending on the situation, to save a lot more money on the back end? And those become things that they're quantifiable within, within some sensitivity analysis. And there's modeling you can do to try to decide, is this worth it to me, along with the quantitative factors that can be modeled and the qualitative things that can't be. That is everyone comfortable doing this conversion or creation of a C corp?
right, right. And I think it's also important to point out that the double taxation only applies when you've made the distribution. That is, you
Yeah.
pay tax because you earned a dollar within the corporation. But if the shareholders need that dollar and you distribute it to them, then they pay tax again. If they don't need the dollar, though, then there's no additional tax. So, for instance, if you have shareholders that are also employees at the company and are using that salary just to pay for normal living expenses or something, or if the shareholders have already created an investment portfolio that would allow them to live for a few years without those distributions, those dividends from the corporation, then you don't really have double taxation. You just have the single level of taxation at the corporate level. And I mean, that's another reason why I think the change in the holding period is so important, because now you you don't have to worry about the possible penalty of double taxation for as long a period, because you can still get a partial loaf, early on once you hit that 3-year mark.
Completely right. It really depends how much profit needs to be distributed from the corp in general. Is there ways to scale that back? Are there ways to minimize that if you're going to do this? And that would help. That would go a long way towards getting the qualification.
Now, not everybody who would like a giant capital gain exclusion has a small company. Some people have large companies that have been around for a while, legacy companies, maybe multi-generational family businesses. Um, what could I do about that? Is there anything I could do to try to get something here under 1202?
Yeah, and look, we first should say the details are going to matter here. It as
It
they always
depends. I
do.
got it. Yeah,
Yeah, it
yeah.
as it always does, and it depends. What makes up the assets of that family business and or company. That said, there are things to do like spinning out, let's say you have an established company, a family company that has 2 or 3 different business lines. Let's say, two of them are pretty clear they're not going to qualify for QSBS for various reasons. Maybe the third would, and it could be newer, could be established, whatever the case is. You could spin that out to its own C corporation and try to isolate and have it isolated by itself and really try to segregate the assets that are in that new C corp and have it be, qualify and be less problematic.
Right. That's really helpful. I mean, a lot of stuff to roll up your sleeves on and figure out. And it doesn't always work, but
Right.
with enough attention, you might be able
And,
to find some places to work.
and I'll add just a little further, maybe specifics or context to that example. If that third spun out business has a lot of intellectual property, sorry,
Hmm.
IP, maybe has a lot of goodwill. There could be ways to structure this where the heavy quote unquote assets, things like inventory, cash, real
Right.
estate, things that would be problematic for qualifying for QSBS. You could leave that in some of the other business lines, split out the quote good assets to the other business line and proceed that way. Again, we have to stipulate that this business line has to be totally independent and needs to be operational, needs to be real, all those things. It has to
Sure.
be,
Yeah.
you can't just create this out of thin air. But if this is all legitimate and existed anyway, there's some really interesting things to look into and structure this.
Right, right. I mean, I think a lot of business owners would be familiar with the idea of getting real estate out of the business so that you've got real estate owned separately from the business, but you could also, as you say, separate out patents and copyrights, or you could have other parts of the business separated where you have a business to business line that's a separate company and a business to consumer line that's a separate company. There might be a web only retail kind of part, that kind of thing.
Right,
So there are ways of doing this.
right. And let's give one last caveat. And I feel a little bit like Dr. Doom here, given all the prefaces and warnings while you're given the benefit of the speech. But it's important to try to be transparent and tell people the full story here. If you're going to, split off to a different business line, an existing corporation or family business, there are these attribution rules that I started to talk about previously. They do become important. So
Mhm. Yeah,
there
fair.
are different ways to trip them up. We won't go through all of them here in detail, but suffice to say, keeping in your mind a 50% ownership threshold would be problematic. So put another way, if the larger company, the legacy company owns 50% or more of the new company you set up, that's problematic. It could be problematic. The IRS could look at that and say, well, you didn't really create a new business line. It's still the same. The parent and the subsidiary are too related. They're going to lump that together, and you're not going to it's going to be problematic for QSBS
Yeah,
purposes.
no, those are good points for sure. I guess I would just say that I have seen in my own practice, it happen purely by accident, where the original founders created one kind of business, and then as the business climate changed, the second generation came in and created literally an entirely new corporate entity because they changed the focus from, for example, wholesaling to retailing. And it's different name, different owners, different strategy, and really was not tax motivated at the very beginning. Sometimes you have happy accidents like that can make it even more clear that this is a possibility.
Right.
So, I started out saying that we have clients across the country. I mean, frankly, we have clients across the world. But for people who are US taxpayers and that kind of stuff, they also have to worry about state level taxation. What are the state specific things we have to worry about here?
Sure. So the good news is most states fully conform. So to back up 1 second, each state has to make a decision. It can either fully conform to federal rules, it can partially conform, or it can choose to totally disregard them. Fortunately, most states, including New York, follow QSBS federal rules. So there's a very small handful who partially conform. From my memory, Hawaii is one as an example. Massachusetts used to be one, but I think they now fully conform or are on the path to. The ones that do not conform are problematic. California is the biggest example. California, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, those are the big three where if you live in those states, they're not going to conform to the federal rules. So put differently, you'll get the exclusion from federal capital gains tax on a sale, but you'll face whatever the state tax rate is, which can be meaningful. California, that's up to 13.8% on a sale. There are things to do to mitigate it, to plan around it. But it takes deliberate conversation and planning, not something you can do overnight.
Yeah. So further complexity in planning on the West Coast and California, but still plenty of opportunity. And we haven't even scratched the surface in a lot of ways. I mean, there's more conversations about what adjusted basis means, because $15 million is great, but if I can do 10 times my adjusted basis, which happens to be $10 million, that's even bigger, according to my math. So, $100 million of capital gain exclusion because I was able to change what that number is another step forward in terms of me paying no tax at all on even a quite large sale.
Absolutely.
But
go ahead, Mike.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to just to tie it back to one of your earlier examples of these S corps or family businesses that convert, and let's assume that it all works, that they're under the asset test. Well, their adjusted basis now becomes what they converted to the C corp on day one. So if it's $40 million, that's their potential exclusion. 10 times 40 million.
Right. So the fair market value essentially of the business becomes the basis.
Right.
Which is a different concept, right? Most of the time we think of basis as what did I buy it for?
Yep.
This is adjusted basis, and that adjusted is really important, and is one of the places where we see the most confusion among accountants, other tax professionals that don't work in this all the time. They assume basis means what it always means, and they kind of ignore the adjusted part right before that, which is, a big difference when you can multiply it by 10. So look, this has been really helpful, Kevin. Obviously, there's a lot more we could talk about. Fortunately for people listening, there's a lot more that you've written that's on our website that people can go check out. But we're always happy to talk to people about how they might think about these planning opportunities. So please reach out. So thanks everybody for joining us. We really appreciate your attention, and we look forward to having you join us again at our future episodes.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, Mike.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Business Owner Bootcamp, presented by Wealthspire Advisors. If you have any feedback or questions, including suggestions for future topics and guests, reach out to your hosts or send us an email at clientrelations@wealthspire.com.